Hello and welcome back to this lecture. Now we're still looking at the formation of a contract. We're looking at those building blocks. We've established when a contract might exist, when we have offer and acceptance and the intention to create a contract, but we haven't yet looked at consideration. Now, put very simply, consideration is payment passing under the contract. Okay, now there's a very complicated definition there which is taken from a famous case, Dunlop v Selfridge, and that really just sort of takes that a step further. So consideration, it's either an act, so a promise to do something, maybe to paint someone's house, or a forbearance. You might agree not to do something. You know, I won't build the extension that I was planning to in exchange for you paying me a sum of money. So an act of forbearance of one party, and it can be an act or the promise of an act, and we'll look at that in a second. And this is the price for which the promise of the other is bought. Okay, so basically what we're saying is there must be some payment under the contract. That payment can be now or a promise to do something, and it can be an actual act, or it could be money, or it could be giving up a right to do something that you were otherwise able to do. Now there are three types of consideration that we need to look at. One, executed and executory. These are both valid forms of consideration under a contract. Past consideration, however, is invalid. It cannot form a legally binding contract. So what are these first two? Well, executed consideration is where an act is performed in return for a promise. Now what that means is, perhaps you book a course with First Intuition and we promise that the course will be delivered to you within the next few weeks. So an act, you've paid some money to us, you've made your booking, and we've promised to do something in the future. Executory consideration is a promise for a promise. So perhaps you have booked a course, you've promised that when we invoice you, you will pay us, and we have promised that we will deliver the course in the future. A promise for a promise. Past consideration we're going to look at in a little bit more detail, and this is where the act has already been done when the promise is made. So by the time you make that agreement, that offer and acceptance, you've already provided the consideration. That past consideration can never form the basis of a legally binding contract. And the key case on that is a case called Re McArdle, quite an old case in the 1950s. Now in this case, old Mrs McArdle lived in a large old house, and her family moved in with her. Now her daughter-in-law spent a lot of time improving the house. She spent her money and her time, made the house look really nice. Now you can imagine the scene. Over Sunday lunch one day, the extended family got together, and old Mrs McArdle's children made some comment along the lines of, well, we really like what you've done to Mum's house. It looks really beautiful. We realise you've put a lot of effort into it. So after Mum has died, we will make a payment to you. We'll sell the house and we'll make a payment to you out of the proceeds to reflect that extra work that you've done. Unfortunately, when old Mrs McArdle died, the siblings refused to make a payment to the daughter-in-law. And daughter-in-law tried to enforce her claim, but the court said, well, actually, there is no binding contract here. Although we had offer and acceptance, we even had a written agreement, what we don't have is any consideration provided by the daughter-in-law to the siblings, to the children, because the work that she'd done at that date had already been completed. There was nothing provided at the time of the contract. So kind of sad, but that's the way the law has developed this point. There is, though, because this is the law paper, there is an exception to that rule, and that rule is where we have an offer to pay that is made in situations where there is an implied promise to pay before that past consideration was provided. So how does that work? Well, the lead case on this is a case of an employee who was asked to do some extra work for his employer. In fact, in the case, he was asked to register some patents. He did the extra work, and his employer was so pleased that he offered to share some of the income from the patents with him. Unfortunately, he died before he actually set anything out in writing. So the employee tried to enforce his right to get some income from these patents, and his original arguments were that he should fail because the consideration that he provided in doing the extra work to register the patents was prior to the promise by his employer to give him some of the income. However, the courts looked at this and they said, well, yeah, it was past consideration, but it's within this exception to the rule. Because he's an employee, he was asked to do some extra work. There is therefore an implied promise that he should be paid for that extra work, even though the actual terms of the payment weren't decided until after the event. Now, there are other situations where this implied promise to pay might apply. For instance, a hairdresser. If you go to the hairdresser's and you sit in the chair and the hairdresser cuts your hair, at the end he asks you for some money to pay for the haircut. It would be very odd, wouldn't it, if you could say, well, the haircut is now in the past, it's past consideration, therefore I don't have to pay you. In that situation, there is an implied promise that you will pay the hairdresser when he's done the work, even though you may not have decided on the price at that stage. Similarly, maybe a taxi. Again, usually in a taxi, you get out of, the journey is completed, the taxi driver asks you for the money, and at that point you could say, well, it's past consideration, I've got to where I want to be now. Again, that would be ridiculous, wouldn't it? Because you're in an employment situation or a business situation, there is an implied promise to pay. Now, another one of the examiner's favourites is that, as far as consideration goes, there are two key rules. Consideration must be sufficient, but it need not be adequate. Now, what do they mean? Well, sufficient means it must be something. It must have some value. Now, I remember that as consideration must be sufficient, it begins with S. Consideration must be something, also begins with S. It means it must have some sort of value. It can be a very small value, but it must have some sort of value. The second part of that rule, consideration need not be adequate, means that it does not have to be market value. Okay, so both parties must provide consideration. That consideration must have some value, but it need not be the market value. And the lead case on that is the case Thomas v. Thomas. And again, it's quite a sad case. In this case, Mrs. Thomas's husband died, and he left the family home to his executors. And he said that he wanted his widow, old Mrs. Thomas, to have the use of the house for the rest of her life. So Mr. Thomas's executors decided that they would give his wife a lease. And this lease gave her a right to occupy the house, provided she paid an annual rent of £1 per annum. Now, that has some value. It's £1. We all know what you can do with £1. But it clearly isn't market value for the occupation of the house. Now, later on, the executors said they wanted to get her out of the house, they wanted to sell it, and they said she had no right to stay there because, although there was a lease agreement, which is a contractual agreement, there was no consideration. Now, the courts looked at this and they said, no, that's not the case at all. This £1, although it isn't adequate, it's not market value, it's sufficient to establish a contract. Now, there have been a number of cases where the courts have looked at this sufficiency point in order to decide whether or not consideration has been provided in a contract. So let's have a look at these cases. So the first example there is where somebody had the consideration provided under the contract was to perform an existing statutory duty. So you were already legally obliged to do something that cannot amount to consideration under a contract because you haven't done anything extra in order to contribute to that contract. And the lead case there was where a party offered his friend a sum of money if he appeared in court as a witness for him. Now, the thing is, the claimant here had already been subpoenaed to appear in court, so he'd been served with a legal document requiring him to appear in court. Therefore, when he turned up and gave evidence, he hadn't done anything extra. If perhaps the agreement had been for him to turn up early at court or to wear a particular suit of clothes in court, then he would have been doing something over and above his legal requirements that had already been stipulated in the subpoena, and we might then have had an enforceable contract. Now, the second point there, sort of similar point really, if you have an existing contractual duty to the promisor, so to the, say, the offeree in this case, then you cannot use that as consideration for a further contract unless you are doing something new. You're actually doing something extra beyond the scope of the original contract. Or the courts have more recently taken a more practical rule here and said, well, actually, in some cases, even though you're only doing your existing contractual duty, we will treat this as giving rise to a legally enforceable contract because actually, in practice, both parties have benefited. Now, before we look at the case on this, let's just think about the first scenario there, where the promisee isn't actually doing anything over and above the original contract. Let's imagine that I employ a builder, and that builder is going to build me an extension. Now, he knows that I'd really like that extension finished for Christmas when my family are coming to stay. So in the middle of December, he sort of sucks in his breath and he says, well, actually, it won't be finished, but if you pay me some extra money, I'll get some extra staff in and we'll finish it on time for you. Now, if I agreed to do that, I would not actually have a legally enforceable contract to pay the builder the extra money once he's finished the job, because he hasn't done anything extra. All he has done is build me the extension that he'd originally contracted to build. He hasn't provided anything extra, he hasn't provided any consideration for my offer to pay extra money, and therefore there wouldn't be a binding contract. So a builder who asks for extra money for the same job is not providing consideration. If, however, I'd asked him to build maybe a porch on the end of my extension, so to do something extra, and he'd charge me more, that would be a binding contract because I've agreed to pay more money for the extension, he has agreed to do more work, i.e. to build the porch. Now, the Williams case takes that point a little bit further. So in this case, the Roffey brothers had undertaken a contract to refurbish a block of flats. However, the work was running late, and if the work hadn't been completed on time, then the Roffey brothers would have incurred a financial penalty because the work had overrun. So they agreed to pay Williams an extra sum of money if the work was completed on time. So Williams accepted the extra payment, completed the work on time. The upshot was that Williams had finished the job. Roffey brothers had avoided a financial penalty because the work was finished on time, and they then refused to pay the extra money to Williams because they said, you haven't provided any consideration because you haven't done anything over and above your original promise to pay under the contract. Now, on a strict reading of the law, that was true. However, the court said that the Roffey brothers derived a benefit from this work being completed on time, and therefore we could treat that as amounting to consideration. So they avoided a penalty. Williams, therefore, had earned his extra £10,000. Now, it's a slightly different spin on the old established case law, but you can sort of see that there was a practical point there. The thing to note, though, is that there was no sort of duress or fraud in this case. Williams hadn't done anything wrong. If Williams had done something wrong here, like in the example of my builder who, has let the work overrun, he wouldn't have been entitled to enforce his payment. A third point to note here about consideration is where a contractual duty is owed to a third party. Remember, we said you couldn't treat something as consideration if it was something that was already covered in a contract between you and the other party. But if you owe that duty to a third party who's nothing to do with this contract, then that might actually amount to valid consideration. So this particular case takes a little bit of thought, and a diagram can help here. So we have a situation where the claimant, Scotsman in this case, C, had a contract with X to deliver cargo. And the contract was that C would deliver the cargo wherever X asked him to. So X said, I want you to deliver it to D. So we have the contract, which is the hard blue line here, and then we have the dotted line, which is the delivery of the goods to D, governed by that initial contract. Now, C was a little bit clever here, because he then negotiated with D and said, well, if we deliver these goods to you, you'll need to unload them. And that amounts to a second contract, which is the one in red there. So that was a contract between C and D, where C's consideration was to deliver the goods to D, and D's contract was consideration was to unload the goods. So we have two contracts in play here. Now, when D found out that the claimant was already under an obligation from his original contract with X to deliver those goods, they argued that he hadn't provided anything new to support this second contract, the red contract. But the court said no. They said C's obligation was owed to X, not to D, and therefore it could also amount to consideration in the contract with D. Okay, so you can use it for consideration if it's in a contract with different people. Now, question 3 is an interesting one. It's based on two real cases. Now, in the first one, a crew were engaged to sail a ship from Land's End to John O'Groats for £2,000 each. During the voyage, 2 crew members deserted the ship. So the captain, eager to get the ship to the end of its journey, promised to pay an extra sum to the remaining crew members if they completed the voyage short-handed. So the crew members did so, but when they got home and they tried to enforce their payment, the ship owners refused to pay. And the reason they refused to pay was because they said that there had been insufficient consideration provided by the crew members. They were already contracted to sail the ship to its destination, therefore they hadn't done anything extra. So in that scenario, the promise could not be enforced. It's a bit like the builder, isn't it? He hasn't done anything extra. This is quite an old case as well. A little later there was a second case on very similar facts, but in this scenario half of the crew members had deserted. And the captain made the same promise, I'll pay you extra money if you complete the voyage. Now, again, the crew members complied, they got home, they claimed their payment, and the ship owners refused to pay. And the reason they refused to pay was because they said there had been insufficient consideration. However, in this case, the courts looked at the facts, and they said in this case, the journey was much more onerous. It was much more dangerous. The crew members would have been in a lot more danger, taking a lot more risk, because the ship was so short-handed, because it was only half crewed. And therefore, in this case, the consideration was sufficient. So what we can learn from these two cases is that we need to look at the whole picture. It's not enough just to say, well, somebody's deserted, it doesn't matter. Because at some point, the job that the crew members are doing became a lot more significant. It was a different job. Now, the problem is we don't know where that threshold is. So you'd have to look at the facts of each case and see if you can identify key differences that make that job fundamentally different than it was before the contract was changed. And the final point that's mentioned there, forbearance of existing rights. We talked about that when we looked at the definition. But giving up the right to do something can also be sufficient consideration. But it must have some value to the person that's giving up that right. For instance, I might give up a right to sue the defendant in return for him making a promise to pay something to me instead. Now, the last thing I want to look at in this section is what happens when you give up the right to enforce an existing debt. And we call this the rule in Folkes v. Beer. In this case, the defendant had got a judgment against C. Okay, so C owed money to D. And that sum of money, according to statute, should also have included interest. Now, the parties entered into an agreement, so we had a contract, where they agreed that D would be paid in instalments, but they didn't mention any interest. C made all the payments under the contract, he paid all the instalments, and D then came back and said, actually, you owe me some more money. C said, no, I've honoured the terms of our contract, I've paid you everything that I owe you. There was no mention of interest in our contract, therefore, that's it. But D said, well, actually, in that contract, I gave up the right to receive any interest. But you see, didn't provide me any consideration for giving up that right, and therefore that contract is not enforceable. Therefore, I want to go back to our original agreement where you owed me a sum of money plus interest. So they went to court on those grounds, and the court agreed with the defendant. He said, no, you are entitled to receive the debt plus the statutory interest because C didn't give you any consideration for you to forgo the right to receive this extra interest. So we're taking those rules of sufficiency of consideration and applying that to a debt situation. And this applies in any case where someone agrees to waive a debt. So imagine that I owe you £100 and I come to you and I say, look, I haven't got £100, but I can raise 80. If I pay you £80, will you accept that in full satisfaction of the debt? Even if you say yes, you can still come back and sue me for the extra £20 that I owe you. But there are some exceptions to that. You'd expect that. This is the law paper. And these, again, reasonably often tested. It's the exceptions that tend to be tested. So imagine that I say to you, I can't pay you £100, but I will give you a free course instead. Now, if I do that, I've paid you in goods or services instead of in cash. You've had alternative consideration. That is sufficient consideration. And the reason it's sufficient consideration is that I have given you something you didn't have a right to before. Previously, you had a right to £100. You now have a right to a course. Therefore, you've got something extra. Where there's a bargain between creditors. So perhaps I owe money to a group of people. So let's say I owe money to X, Y, and Z. Now, if you all agree to accept less, then although I haven't provided any consideration for that deal, X, Y, and Z have all provided consideration because they've all agreed to accept less, and therefore we have a binding contract. And the third one is where you have, I should say third party, sorry, where you have payment by a third party. So imagine I owe you some money, but my parents agree to pay that debt for me. Now, they can't raise the full amount, so they agree that they'll pay the debt, but they'll only pay, again, say £80 instead of the £100 that I owe you. Now, if you accept that payment from my parents, you've actually received something that you didn't have before. You've had some consideration because you have had a right to receive money from my parents. Previously, you only had a right to receive money from me. Therefore, in that circumstance, that payment from my parents would be valid consideration. Now, pause the recording and have a go at question 4, and then we can compare our answers. So in this case, A owes B and C and D £100 each. So A owes B, C and D £100 each. And they each agree to accept £90 in full satisfaction of the debt. A also owes X £200. And T, third party, T, offers to pay £150 on condition that X discharges A from the debt. So, first of all, can B, C and D take action against A for the remaining £30? Well, the answer there is no, and the reason they can't is because that is a creditor's agreement. Can X take action against A? Well, again, the answer there is no, because X has accepted part payment, admittedly, but he's accepted it from a third party, and therefore that counts as valid consideration. Okay, so I hope you got that one right. That takes us to the end of consideration. Again, it's a topic that can pick up quite a lot of questions in the exam. So have a go at some questions and get used to how the examiner chooses to test this topic.